Billionaire comes home early and explodes with rage at what he sees. Richard Thompson shoved the mansion door with enough force to make the glass tremble in its frames. The sound echoed through the wide hallway as his hurried steps cut through the afternoon silence. 3 hours earlier than planned, his arrival should have been a pleasant surprise, but what his eyes found in the kitchen froze every muscle in his body. Emily was sitting at the table, wearing that red outfit he liked so much, but that wasn't what held his attention. It was the scene unfolding before him. His wife was carefully holding a spoon, bringing it to the lips of an elderly woman he immediately recognized, his mother, Mrs. Margaret. The same mother who was supposed to be at Sunset Care Center, the most expensive and renowned institution in New York. Not there, sitting in his kitchen as if she belonged in that place. "What is going on here?" Richard's voice came out like thunder. Emily turned so fast she almost knocked over the soup pot. Her eyes widened, and he could see fear crossing her face. But what surprised him most was that she didn't drop the spoon. She kept her hand steady, protective, as if guarding something precious. "Richard, you're early. Don't state the obvious, I asked a question." He took 2 steps into the kitchen, and anger boiled in every word. "What is my mother doing here?" Mrs. Margaret looked up at her son. There was a gentle smile on her wrinkled face, but there was also that haze Richard knew well. The same haze that had been there for 2 years, ever since the diagnosis of progressive dementia had been confirmed. She looked at him, as if trying to piece together a complicated puzzle, searching to fit his face into some memory. "Who is this young man?" the elderly woman asked, turning to Emily. The knife plunged into Richard's chest with those simple words. His own mother didn't recognize him, but he pushed the pain away, replacing it with the fury he knew so well. "Emily, I'm waiting for an answer." His wife stood up slowly. She was 32 years old, with blonde hair falling in soft waves over her shoulders, and at that moment she seemed to be fighting an internal battle. Richard had known her for 7 years, married to her for 5, and had never seen that expression on her face. Determination. Defiance. "She is here because this is her place." Her place? Richard let out a dry laugh. "Her place is at the care center, at Sunset Care Center, where I pay a fortune for her to have the best care." "The best care?" Emily took a step forward, and her voice had a firmness he didn't recognize. "You call that care?" "Don't start, Emily. Your mother arrived here with bruises on her arms." "Bruises?" The words came out in a low tone, but each syllable carried weight. "And you want to talk about best care?" Richard closed his eyes for a moment. The contract he had just closed in Chicago was worth $80 million. $80 million. And now he was there, arguing about something he had decided months ago. His mother needed professional care. She couldn't stay at home. She couldn't disrupt his routine, his image, his business. She fell. Elderly people fall. It's part of the condition. "She didn't fall, Richard." Emily moved back near Mrs. Margaret, adjusting the blanket covering the elderly woman's shoulders. "And you know that." "What I know is that I was clear when I left my mother there. Very clear." He pointed his finger at his wife. "And you didn't have authorization to take her out of there." "I didn't need authorization." Emily met his eyes. "I needed courage. Something you lost a long time ago." The silence that fell over the kitchen was heavy. Mrs. Margaret began to hum softly, an old song Richard vaguely recognized from childhood. Her hands trembled slightly, and Emily sat back down, picking up the spoon again. "How long has she been here?" 2 weeks. 2 weeks? His voice rose an octave. 2 weeks and you didn't tell me? You were traveling. Chicago, then Los Angeles, then Boston. 3 cities in 15 days. Emily didn't take her eyes off her mother-in-law as she spoke. "It didn't seem like the right time to call and say I brought your mother home." "Because it wasn't your decision to make." The shouting made Mrs. Margaret flinch. Her eyes widened with fear, and she began to make a low sound, almost a stifled cry. Emily immediately dropped the spoon and hugged the elderly woman, making circular motions on her back. "It's all right, Mrs. Margaret. It's all right." Her voice was a soft whisper. "No one will hurt her here." Richard watched the scene with clenched fists. Part of him wanted to shout louder, to make it clear who was in charge of that house. But another part, a small part he tried to ignore, felt something different seeing how his mother calmed down in Emily's arms. "We have a dinner tonight." He changed tactics, speaking more quietly. "The partners from Thompson Enterprises are coming here. You know that. We scheduled it weeks ago." "I know. And you intend for my mother to stay here, with strangers in the house?" "Your mother will stay in her room." Emily pointed to the hallway. "I adapted the ground floor guest room. She doesn't need to climb stairs, and it's close to the kitchen and the living room." "You adapted?" Richard ran his hand through his hair, feeling the headache starting. "Without asking me. Without consulting me. If I had asked, you would have said no." "Exactly." Mrs. Margaret looked back at Richard. This time there was something different in her eyes, a flicker. Brief, but it was there. She tilted her head and said, in a voice that seemed to come from far away, "Richie." The nickname no one had used for decades. Richie. That's what she called him when he was a child. Before the money, before the business, before all of this. Richard felt the floor move beneath his feet. "Richie, my boy." Mrs. Margaret extended one of her trembling hands. "You're back." Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, please take a moment to like and especially subscribe to the channel. It really helps us who are just starting out. Now continuing. Emily watched her husband carefully. She could see the war happening inside him, the struggle between the man he had become and the boy who still existed somewhere deep inside. Richard didn't move, didn't touch his mother's hand. After a few seconds, Mrs. Margaret lowered her arm, and the fog returned to her eyes. "You will take her back, today." He turned his back. "I'm calling the clinic now." "No." The word came out firmly. Richard stopped in the middle of the hallway and turned slowly. "What did you say?" "I said no." Emily stood up, keeping one hand on Mrs. Margaret's shoulder. "I won't let you take her back to that place. Are you challenging me in my house?" "It's our house." Emily took 2 steps forward. "I've lived here for 5 years. I clean, I organize, I host your clients, I make your coffee every morning. This is my house as much as yours." Richard had never heard Emily speak like that. In their 5 years of marriage, she had always been kind, agreeing with his decisions, smiling at the right people, keeping everything perfect. He had chosen her precisely for that. Young enough not to question, beautiful enough to impress, and well-behaved enough not to cause trouble. But the woman in front of him now was not that Emily. Or maybe it was the real Emily and he had never paid enough attention to notice. "I'm not going to argue about this." He took his phone out of his pocket. "I'm calling the Sunset Care Center now. They will come to pick up my mother in an hour." "They won't." Emily crossed her arms. "How can they not?" "Because Sunset Care Center no longer accepts your mother as a patient." Richard froze with the phone in his hand. "What are you saying?" "I called there 2 days ago to sort out some pending matters." Emily moved back near her mother-in-law, but kept her eyes fixed on her husband. "And the coordinator informed me that Mrs. Margaret was, how can I put it, asked not to return." "That's ridiculous. I pay $15,000 a month." "Paid," Emily corrected. "And money doesn't matter when the patient exhibits aggressive behavior that endangers other residents." Aggressive behavior. Richard looked at his mother, who was now nibbling on a piece of bread that Emily had placed in front of her. "She can barely hold a spoon." "Exactly." Emily picked up an envelope that was on the counter and handed it to him. "Read it." Richard opened the envelope forcefully, tearing part of the paper. It was an official letter from Sunset Care Center. His eyes scanned the lines, and with each word reality began to form. Aggressive behavior, nighttime crises, refusal of medication, attempts to leave the facility, and at the end the conclusion. "Due to recent history, we recommend care in a family environment where the patient feels more secure." "This doesn't make sense." Richard crumpled the paper. "My mother has never been aggressive in her life." "She wasn't." Emily took a deep breath. "Until they started giving her too many sedatives." "Sedatives are part of the treatment. Excessive sedatives are abuse." Emily pointed to a notebook on the table. "It's all written down here. Every medication she took, every dosage, every time." I got it all from a nurse who felt sorry for her. Richard picked up the notebook and began flipping through it, page after page of detailed notes, names of medications he didn't even know, dosages that increased every week, and on the last pages, different notes in Emily's handwriting. Mrs. Margaret cried today. Mrs. Margaret didn't want to eat. Mrs. Margaret asked about her son. Why were you doing this? He held up the notebook. Why were you tracking all this? Because someone had to. Emily didn't look away. And you were too busy. Busy building an empire to provide comfort for this family. What family, Richard? Her voice cracked a little. You travel 300 days a year. When you're home, you spend your time locked in your office, and your only blood family was being medicated into oblivion in an expensive care center. That's not how it works. Richard slammed the notebook on the table, making Mrs. Margaret startle again. She has dementia. She needs professional care. She needs love. Emily held her mother-in-law's hands. And that, no professional can give. The argument was interrupted by the sound of footsteps coming from the hallway. Dorothy, the housekeeper who had worked in the house for 15 years, appeared at the kitchen door. She was nearly 60, with greying hair tied in a bun and a blue apron she always wore. Her eyes went straight to Richard. Dr. Richard, you're home early. Dorothy, did you know about this? He pointed at his mother. Did you know my wife brought my mother here? Dorothy looked at Emily, then back at Richard. There was something on her face, an expression he couldn't decipher. Yes, sir, I did. And you didn't think you should tell me? Mrs. Emily asked me not to. Dorothy entered the kitchen, picking up a dish towel. And I agreed with her. You agreed? Richard felt the anger rising again. Since when do the employees in this house get to agree or disagree with anything? Since I saw Mrs. Margaret crying every night in that care center. Dorothy spoke softly, but there was firmness in her voice. I visited her every week, Dr. Richard. Did you know that? Richard didn't know. Had no idea. She asked me to bring you, every week. Dorothy stepped closer, her eyes glistening. She said her son had gotten lost, that she needed to find him. She asked if you were angry with her, if she'd done something wrong. Dorothy, I didn't ask for your opinion on this. I know you didn't. The housekeeper wiped her eyes with her apron. But I'm giving it anyway. Your mother raised you alone after your father left. You were 5 years old. She worked selling food at the market, washing clothes for others, cleaning houses at 3 different places. All so you could study. I know my family history. Do you? Dorothy looked at him with an intensity that made him step back. Because you seem to have forgotten, the woman who gave everything for you is right there, needing help, and you want to send her back to a place where they left her alone in a dark room because it was easier. Richard felt as if he'd been punched. Dorothy had never spoken to him that way. Nobody spoke to him that way. He was Richard Thompson, owner of the largest luxury real estate developer in New York. People bowed when he entered a room. Partners trembled when he slammed his hand on the table. But there in his own kitchen, 3 women stared at him without fear. You don't understand. He tried another approach. Tonight, I have an important dinner. The 3 biggest investors of Thompson Enterprises are coming here. I can't have my mother wandering around the house, confused, scared. They'll think I can't even take care of my own family. How will they trust me with millions in investments? So that's it. Emily shook her head. It's not about your mother, it's about your image. Image is everything in the business world. Richard spread his arms. You don't understand how things work out there. One sign of weakness and they'll eat you alive. And taking care of your mother is weakness? Emily asked. In my world, yes. The words came out before he could stop them, and the moment they were spoken, Richard realized how terrible they sounded. Mrs. Margaret, who had stayed quiet during the whole argument, suddenly stood up. Her movements were slow, shaky, but there was determination there. She walked over to Richard, and before he could step away, placed one hand on his face. Richie, my son. Her voice was clear now, surprisingly clear. When did you become such a sad person? The words pierced something inside Richard. He stood frozen, feeling the gentle touch of his mother's wrinkled hand on his face. For a moment, It was as if all the layers he had built over the years dissolved, and he was just a boy looking at his mother. But then her hand fell and the fog returned to her eyes. She looked around, confused, and Emily quickly guided her back to the chair. Richard left the kitchen without saying another word. He went up the stairs 2 steps at a time, entered the study and slammed the door. His fingers trembled as he picked up the phone. He dialed the number for Sunset Care Center, but when they answered, he hung up. He tried another facility, but did the same thing. He dropped into the leather chair behind the desk. That desk cost $30,000. The chair, $15,000. The Persian rug underneath, $50,000. Everything in the house had a price, had value. But when he tried to put a value on the look in his mother's eyes, asking when he had become a sad person, he couldn't find an answer. 2 hours later, Richard came downstairs already dressed for dinner. Harrington suit, silk tie, Richfield shoes. Everything perfect as always. But when he reached the ground floor, he heard voices coming from the living room. Voices he shouldn't be hearing. He entered the living room and stopped at the doorway. Mrs. Margaret was sitting on the sofa, and around her were 3 men in suits, his partners, Michael Roberts, William Peterson, and Daniel Wilson, the 3 biggest investors of Thompson Enterprises, and all 3 were listening attentively while his mother told a story. And Richie, just a little boy, decided he was going to sell lemonade in front of the house. Mrs. Margaret laughed, her hands moving as she spoke. But he put in too much sugar. It was a sticky mess. And when the first customer tasted it, he made a face I still remember to this day. The 3 men laughed. They laughed genuinely, not that forced laughter from business meetings. And Emily was there too, seated beside her mother-in-law, with one hand resting on her shoulder. "Richard," Michael was the first to see him. "Your wife welcomed us, and what a wonderful surprise to meet your mother. Mrs. Margaret is delightful." Richard forced a smile and entered the room. His plan had been to keep his mother hidden in the bedroom, away from the investor's eyes. But there she was, the center of attention, telling stories from his childhood. "Mrs. Margaret was telling us about how you started being an entrepreneur as a child." William turned around, his eyes shining. "It seems you were born for business indeed." Yes. Richard didn't know what to say. "I always told the boys," Mrs. Margaret continued, and at that moment she seemed lucid, fully present. "If you want something in this life, work for it. No one is going to give you anything for free." "The boys?" Daniel asked. "Do you have siblings, Richard?" There was a moment of silence, a heavy silence. Emily looked at Richard, and he saw concern in her eyes. "I did," Mrs. Margaret replied, her voice growing quieter. "My Jennifer, my daughter, she left us so young." The pain in her voice was palpable. Richard closed his eyes. Jennifer, his younger sister. He hadn't spoken about her in years. She had passed away when she was only 19, a victim of a heart condition no one knew she had. That had happened 25 years ago, but for Mrs. Margaret, the pain seemed fresh. "I'm so sorry, Mrs. Margaret," Michael said sincerely. She sang so beautifully. Mrs. Margaret stared into space. She sang for Richie to sleep every night. "The black sheep. Take this child who's afraid of scary faces." Her voice began to sing, faint but sweet. And Richard remembered nights when Jennifer would put him to sleep because their mother was working the night shift. Remembered her singing that song, making funny faces to make him laugh. Emily started singing along softly, and Mrs. Margaret smiled at her, a genuine smile full of affection. "You remind me of her." The elderly woman touched Emily's face. "My Jennifer, always so kind." Daniel stood up and approached Richard, placing a hand on his shoulder. "You know, Richard, I've always admired your professional success. But seeing that you keep your mother with you, that you take care of her personally, that shows character." He lowered his voice. "I put my father in a nursing home last year, and I regret it every day." Richard didn't know how to respond. He wasn't taking care of his mother. It was Emily, and he had come home a few hours ago wanting to undo it all. Dorothy entered the room announcing that dinner was served. Everyone moved to the dining room, but when they tried to have Mrs. Margaret stay in the living room, she clung to Emily's arm. "I won't be alone." There was panic in her voice. "Please, don't leave me alone again." Richard saw Emily look at him, silently asking for permission, and he realized she was waiting for him to make the right choice. Not the choice that protected his image, but the right choice. "Mom." The word felt strange in his mouth. He hadn't called her that in so long. "You can have dinner with us, if you'd like." Mrs. Margaret's eyes lit up. She let go of Emily's arm and reached out her hand to Richard. He hesitated for a second, but then held that trembling hand and guided it to the dining room. Dinner was strange. Mrs. Margaret got confused sometimes, calling people by the wrong names, asking where she was, but the investors were kind. Michael even told a story about his own grandmother, who had also had dementia. And when Dorothy served dessert, Mrs. Margaret picked up the wrong spoon, and Emily gently helped her without making a fuss, without embarrassing her. Richard watched everything in silence. He watched how his wife cared for his mother with such delicacy, how she anticipated her needs, how she spoke softly and clearly, how she smiled when the elderly woman got confused, and he realized he didn't know that woman. Not really. Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, take a moment to like and especially subscribe to the channel. It really helps us who are just starting out. Now continuing. After the investors left, it was past 11 at night. Emily was putting Mrs. Margaret to sleep in the room she had prepared. Richard stood still in the hallway, listening. "Let's change these clothes, Mrs. Margaret. Put on something comfortable." Emily spoke as if she were with a child. "You're so good to me." Mrs. Margaret's weak voice reached the hallway. "Why? Why do you take care of me?" "Because you deserve to be taken care of." Emily's answer was simple. "My son, is he a good man?" The question made Richard hold his breath. "He is. Deep down he is," Emily replied, and Richard didn't know if she really believed that or if she was just being kind. "He's just lost." "We all get lost sometimes," Mrs. Margaret said. "I get lost every day now. I don't remember where I am. I don't remember people. But there's one thing I never forget." "What is it, Mrs. Margaret?" "The love I felt when I held my boy for the first time." Her voice was full of emotion. "And the love I feel now when you hold me like this. Love doesn't forget, my dear. It may forget names, places, even faces. But love doesn't." Richard heard a sob. He didn't know if it was from Emily or his mother or both. He moved away from the hallway before anyone saw him there. He went up to the bedroom, but when he entered, Emily wasn't there. He waited. Half an hour, an hour. When she finally appeared, her eyes were red. "She's asleep," Emily said, going straight to the bathroom without looking at him. "Emily, we need to talk." "Not now, Richard, I'm tired." "It's important." She stopped at the bathroom door and turned around. There was something different in her face, a hardness he didn't know. "What do you want? Want to yell more? Want to tell me I shouldn't have brought your mother? Want to threaten me with divorce again?" "I didn't threaten with divorce." "Yes, you did. This afternoon when you said I was interfering in things that weren't my business." Emily crossed her arms. "You said if I didn't obey, there would be consequences." Richard didn't remember saying exactly that, but maybe he had. The anger he felt earlier seemed distant now. "The investors liked her." "I know." Emily didn't seem impressed. "Because your mother is a wonderful person. You just forgot that." "I didn't forget." "Yes, you did." She took a step forward. "When was the last time you really talked to her? Before the dementia, before the care center? When was the last time you sat with your mother and just talked?" Richard thought, but couldn't find an answer. It had been years. Many years. "I was busy building the company. Always busy." Emily shook her head. "Always traveling, always in meetings, always making more money." "For what, Richard? What's all that money for?" "To provide comfort. To not go through hardships." "Did you go through hardships as a child?" She already knew the answer. "Your mother made sure you didn't. She worked to the bone so you wouldn't go hungry, had clothes, could study, and when you were finally able to repay her, to do something for her, what did you do?" You put her in a care center and forgot she existed." "It wasn't like that." Richard felt the anger returning. "The dementia was getting worse. She needed care I couldn't provide." "You didn't even try?" Emily raised her voice for the first time. "You didn't even try. At the first sign she was getting sick, you looked for the most expensive care center and left her there, as if money solved everything. And doesn't it?" "No, it doesn't." Emily wiped away a tear that was rolling down. "Do you want to know what does solve things? Presence, time, genuine care. Things money can't buy, Richard." They fell silent. Richard sat on the bed, suddenly feeling the weight of everything. "I don't know how to do this," he admitted, and his voice came out low. "I don't know how to take care of her. I get nervous when she doesn't recognize me. I get angry when she gets confused. I'm not good at this." Emily approached and sat beside him on the bed. She didn't touch him, just stayed there. "No one is good at it at first," she said softly, "but we learn. For love, we learn." She sang that song today, the song Jennifer used to sing. "I know." "I hadn't thought about Jennifer in years," Richard confessed. "It was too painful." "So, you buried the pain, like you bury everything that bothers you." Emily looked at him. "But buried pain doesn't disappear, Richard. It just waits, growing in the dark." "What do I do now?" "You decide." Emily stood up. "Your mother can stay here, where at least one person in this house cares about her, or you can send her away again. Look for another expensive care center, and pretend you're doing the right thing. The choice is yours." "And if I send her away?" he asked, and there was a bigger question behind that one. "Now, will you stay?" Emily looked at him for a long moment. "No." The answer was firm. "If you send your mother away, I'm going with her. I'll find a place for the two of us, and you can stay with your empty mansion and your money. Because I can't stay married to someone who abandons those who need him most." And with those words, she went into the bathroom and closed the door. Richard sat on the bed for hours. He couldn't sleep. His mind wouldn't stop spinning, reliving the day, the arrival, the anger, the argument, the dinner, his mother's words, Emily's words. In the early hours, he went down the stairs and went to the room where his mother was. The door was ajar and he pushed it slowly. A small nightlight illuminated the room. Mrs. Margaret was lying down, sleeping, but her face was peaceful. It didn't have that tense expression he had seen so many times at the care center. The room was different. Emily had put photos on the walls, old photos, of him as a child, of the family, of Jennifer. There was a scent of lavender in the air. The curtains were light, letting the light in. It was cozy. It was a home. Richard approached the bed and stood looking at his mother. She looked so small there, so fragile. The hands that once lifted him, that worked non-stop, now trembled even in her sleep. The hair that was black when he was a child, now completely white. "Mother," he whispered, not expecting an answer. "I'm sorry." She didn't wake up, but he kept talking. "I should have taken better care of you. Should have visited more. Should have—" His voice broke. "Should have loved you better." When he returned to the room, Emily was awake, sitting on the bed. She looked at him when he entered, but said nothing. "She stays," Richard said. "My mother stays here. And I—" He took a deep breath. "I will try. I will try to be better." Emily didn't smile, but something in her eyes softened. "Okay, but I don't know how." "Then we learn together." She extended her hand and he held it. "Together, Richard. Not you alone, not me alone. Together." The next morning, Richard cancelled a trip to Atlanta. There was an important meeting about a new venture, but for the first time in years he put something else first. When Emily came down to the kitchen, she found him trying to make oatmeal. "What are you doing?" She couldn't hide her surprise. "Trying to make breakfast for my mother." He looked at the pot where a strange mixture was bubbling. "But I think I did it wrong." Emily came closer and looked inside the pot. It was burnt at the bottom and raw on top. "You need to stir while it cooks," she said, taking the wooden spoon from his hand. "Like this." Richard watched her fix the oatmeal, adding more milk, adjusting the heat. It felt strange to be there, in the kitchen, doing something so simple. He was used to signing million-dollar contracts, making decisions that affected hundreds of employees. But there, making oatmeal, he felt completely lost. "Dorothy told me my mother likes cinnamon in her oatmeal." "She does," Emily confirmed. "And a little bit of honey." When Mrs. Margaret came down for breakfast, guided by Dorothy, Richard served the oatmeal himself. The elderly woman looked at the plate, then at him, confused. "Who are you?" she asked. It hurt. It hurt more than Richard expected. But Emily put a hand on his shoulder, and he took a deep breath. "I'm Richie, Mom. Your son." Mrs. Margaret studied his face for a long moment. Then her eyes briefly lit up. "My Richie, you've grown so much." And Richard realized something. She didn't recognize him as the 47-year-old man he was. She recognized him as the boy he had been. And perhaps, in that moment, that was exactly who he needed to be. The following days were difficult. Richard tried to help, but found he didn't know how to do almost anything. He didn't know how to bathe his mother without scaring her. He didn't know how to change diapers when needed. He didn't know how to handle the nighttime episodes when she woke up confused and frightened. One night he was alone with her. Emily had gone out shopping and Dorothy had already left. Mrs. Margaret woke up screaming, saying there were strangers in the house who wanted to hurt her. Richard tried to calm her down, but the more he spoke, the more agitated she became. "Get out! Get out of my house!" She pushed her son, not recognizing him. "Mum, it's me. I'm Richie." But she wouldn't listen. She kept screaming, and Richard didn't know what to do. He felt powerless, useless. The anger that had always been his companion began to rise, but then he remembered what Emily had said. "For love, we learn." He stopped trying to hold her. He stopped speaking loudly. Instead, he sat on the floor beside her bed and began to sing. It was off-key, he didn't remember the words well, but he sang. "The black sheep, take this child who's afraid of scary faces." Mrs. Margaret's voice quieted down. She stopped moving, just stared at Richard, and then slowly she sat down on the floor beside him. "Jennifer used to sing that song," she said, her voice soft now. "I know, Mom. She was so beautiful. My daughter." She was. Richard felt his throat tighten. "She was beautiful." Mrs. Margaret rested her head on her son's shoulder. "You're handsome too, boy. Like your father." They stayed there, sitting on the floor for almost an hour. When Emily came home and found them like that, she said nothing. She just sat on the other side of Mrs. Margaret, and the three of them stayed there, in silence. 2 weeks passed. Richard still cancelled meetings, still left calls unanswered. His partners began to question him. Michael called saying they needed urgent decisions about the new venture in Denver. "I can't come now," Richard said on the phone. "What do you mean you can't? There are $300 million at stake." "I know, but I need to stay here." "Because of your mother?" Michael didn't hide his surprise. "Richard, hire another nurse, I don't know. But the company needs you. My mother needs me too." When he hung up, Richard felt something strange. It wasn't guilt, it wasn't regret. It was almost like relief, as if a weight he had been carrying for years was finally being lifted. But not everything was perfect. The company began to feel his absence. Contracts were delayed, decisions were left pending. And one afternoon, William showed up at the house unannounced. "Richard, we need to talk." He didn't wait to be invited. He came right in. They sat in the office, and Richard could see the tension on his partner's face. "What's going on?" William got straight to the point. "You've been missing meetings, not answering emails, and the Portland project has been stalled for 2 weeks because you won't approve the final budget." "I've been busy." "Busy?" William leaned forward. "Richard, we built this company together, 15 years of work, and now you're putting everything aside for what, because of your mother?" "Yes." The answer was simple. "I understand you want to take care of her, but hire someone. We have the resources for that." I've tried that route. It didn't work. So what are you going to do? Are you going to abandon the company? William was turning red. We have commitments, Richard. Deadlines. People who depend on us. I know, Richard sighed, and I'll find a way to balance things, but I won't choose the company over my family anymore. Not again. Not again? William seemed confused. What are you talking about? Jennifer. The name came out with difficulty. My sister. She passed away alone in a hospital while I was closing our first big contract. Remember? That development in Denver, the one that put the company on the map. William fell silent. My mother called me saying Jennifer was feeling sick, that she had gone to the hospital. I said I would go as soon as the meeting was over. Richard felt the tears starting to fall. But the meeting lasted for hours, and when I finally got to the hospital, it was too late. She was already gone. Richard, you never told me that. Because it was easier to pretend it never happened. He wiped his face angrily. Easier to throw myself into work, make more money, build an empire, as if financial success could make up for the fact that I wasn't there when my sister needed me most. William stared at his partner as if seeing him for the first time. And your mother? My mother never blamed me, not once, but I blame myself. Every day. Richard stood up and went to the window. And now she needs me, and I won't fail again. So if that means losing contracts, losing money, even losing the company, so be it. Because in the end, when I'm old like her, lying in a bed not remembering who I am, I want to be sure that at least I tried to be a decent son. The office was silent for long minutes. Finally, William stood up. All right, he said. I'll cover your meetings for now. Michael and Daniel can handle some decisions. But Richard, you need to find a balance. The company is your responsibility too. I will, I just need a little more time. After William left, Richard was alone in the office. He heard sounds from downstairs. Laughter. Emily was showing old photo albums to Mrs. Margaret, and the elderly woman in one of her lucid moments was telling stories about each picture. He went down and stood in the doorway of the living room. The two women were sitting together on the sofa, so close that their shoulders were touching, and on the table was a photo frame he hadn't seen before. It was a picture of him, Jennifer, and their mother. He was about 8, Jennifer 6. They were in a park, smiling at the camera. This one was taken in Central Park, Mrs. Margaret said, and her voice was clear. It was Jennifer's birthday. She wanted to go to the park more than anything. We didn't have money for big parties, you know, but we had a picnic, bologna sandwiches, boxed juice, and a cake I made myself. Simple, but she loved it. Sounds like a beautiful day, Emily commented. It was the best day. Mrs. Margaret smiled, but there was sadness too. I always thought we'd have more days like that. But time passes so fast. 1 minute they're children, the next... Her voice faded. Richard entered the room, and the two women looked at him. I remember that day, he said, sitting in the armchair across from them. Jennifer ate so much cake she got sick on the way back. Mrs. Margaret laughed, a genuine laugh that made Richard's heart tighten. She did, and you did too. You two were such greedy eaters. It was strange to talk about Jennifer. For years Richard had avoided the subject, built walls around that pain. But there, in that moment, it felt right. It felt necessary. She sang all the time, Richard continued. It didn't matter where we were, supermarket, bus, at home, always singing. She had the most beautiful voice in the world. Mrs. Margaret agreed, and her eyes grew distant. She wanted to be a singer, you know. She had even started taking lessons. Said one day she'd sing on the radio and everyone would know her. I didn't know that, Richard admitted. There's a lot you don't know. His mother looked at him, and for a moment she was completely lucid. Because you stopped asking, you stopped being present. The words could have sounded like an accusation, but they weren't. It was just a fact, a truth Richard needed to hear. You're right. He leaned forward. But I want to change that. If you give me a chance, I want to try to get to know you again, know who you are now. Mrs. Margaret studied her son for a long moment. Then she reached out her hand, and Richard held it. Her hand was small, full of wrinkles, but still had strength. "It's okay, my son," she said. "It's always time to start over." That night, for the first time since his mother had arrived, Richard joined Emily to put Mrs. Margaret to bed. They worked in silence, each knowing what to do without needing to speak. And when the elderly woman was finally lying down, comfortable and sleepy, Richard leaned over and kissed her forehead. "Good night, Mother." She opened her eyes, and there was recognition there. Real, true recognition. "Good night, Richie," she whispered. "Thank you for coming back home." Richard and Emily left the room in silence. When they reached the hallway, he held her arm. "Thank you," he said. "For what?" "For not giving up on me, for taking care of her when I didn't have the courage, for showing me I was wrong." Emily looked at him, and there was something different in her gaze. It wasn't love. Not yet. The damage had been too great to be fixed so quickly. But there was hope. "You're trying," she said. "That's all I can ask for." Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, please take a moment to like and especially subscribe to the channel. It really helps us who are just starting out. Now continuing. In the following weeks, Richard developed a routine. He woke up early before his mother and prepared breakfast. It wasn't perfect. He burned toast and made coffee too strong, but he tried. Afterward, while Emily helped Mrs. Margaret with her bath and clothes, he read emails and made essential calls. He learned to work from home. He turned part of the office into a space where he could have virtual meetings. William and Michael took on more responsibilities at the company, and surprisingly, things worked. Not perfectly, but they worked. One afternoon, the private doctor came for a routine visit. Dr. Robert Miller was a man in his 60s, with greying hair and thick-framed glasses. He had been caring for Mrs. Margaret since the diagnosis. After examining the patient, he called Richard and Emily to speak privately. "I need to say I'm impressed," Dr. Robert began. "When I last saw Mrs. Margaret 3 months ago, she was deteriorating rapidly. But today, she's better, significantly better." "Better how?" Richard asked. "Dementia can't be reversed." "No, it can't, but it can be slowed down, and more importantly, the quality of life can improve." The doctor picked up a notebook. "Mrs. Margaret has more moments of clarity. She's eating better. She hasn't had as many anxiety episodes, and all of this is the result of the environment she's in." "The environment?" Emily repeated. "Yes, dementia patients benefit greatly from routine, from familiar faces, from genuine affection." Dr. Robert looked at both of them. "At the care center, she was in a sterile room surrounded by strangers, being over-medicated. Here, she has you. She has love. And that, believe it or not, is more powerful than any medicine I can prescribe." Richard felt a tightness in his chest. He had fought so hard against this, had resisted having his mother at home so much, and now he discovered it was exactly what she needed. "Will she get better?" he asked, and there was hope in his voice. Dr. Robert hesitated. "Dementia is progressive, Richard. There will come a day when she no longer has clear moments, when she won't recognize anyone, not even herself." He put a hand on the businessman's shoulder. "But you're giving her the best days she can still have, and that's what matters." After the doctor left, Richard sat quietly. Emily sat beside him on the couch. "Are you okay?" "I'm thinking about what he said, about her eventually not recognizing anyone anymore." Richard looked at his hands. "I wasted so much time, years I could have spent with her." "Then don't waste any more," Emily said simply, and Richard didn't waste. He started spending entire afternoons talking with his mother. Sometimes she was lucid and told stories from the past. Other times she was confused and called him by different names, but he stayed there, present, listening. One day, Mrs. Margaret asked about Richard's father, Frank, a man who had left their lives when Richard was just 5 years old. "He was handsome, you know," Mrs. Margaret said, looking at the garden through the window. "Tall, dark hair, an easy smile. He won me over at a 4th of July party." "Did you miss him when he left?" Richard had never had the courage to ask this before. "Every day," the answer was honest, "but at the same time I felt relief. Frank drank a lot. When he drank, he became different, aggressive, and I was afraid that you would grow up seeing that, thinking it was normal. Richard didn't know this. He didn't know his father had problems with drinking. You never told me that, because I didn't want you to grow up angry at him or pitying me. Mrs. Margaret looked at her son. I wanted you to grow up knowing you could be better, be different. And was I? Richard asked. Different from him? His mother was silent for a moment, and Richard feared the answer. You're different in many ways. You don't drink, you don't fight, you built a good life. She paused. But in one way, you're the same. In what way? You're both afraid of being weak. Mrs. Margaret held her son's hand. Your father thought asking for help was weakness, that admitting problems was failure, and you, my son, think feeling is weakness, that loving is vulnerability. The words hit Richard like a bullet, because they were true. He had spent his life building walls, keeping distance, controlling everything around him. Because control meant strength, and strength meant security. I don't want to be like him, Richard said, and his voice trembled. Then don't be. Mrs. Margaret squeezed his hand tighter. Learn the thing he never learned. That strength isn't about not needing anyone. Strength is letting people in, even when it hurts. That night, Richard told Emily about the conversation. They were lying in bed in the dark, and he talked about his father, about his fears, about everything. I always thought if I were rich enough, successful enough, nothing could hurt me. He confessed. But it doesn't work that way, does it? No. Emily turned on her side to look at him. Money doesn't protect from pain, from loss, from life. I'm afraid, Richard admitted, and it was the first time he had said those words out loud. Afraid of losing her, of losing you, of losing everything. We're all afraid, Richard. Emily touched his face. But fear can't be an excuse not to live, not to love. How do you do it? He asked. How do you love without fear? I don't love without fear, she smiled sadly. I love despite the fear, it's different. Richard pulled his wife closer. It had been months since they had been this close, not really, and when he kissed her, it was different. It wasn't passion, it was connection. It was two wounded people trying to find each other again. The months passed. Mrs. Margaret had good days and bad days, days when she recognized everyone and told jokes that made everyone laugh, and days when she didn't know where she was, scared and confused. But Richard was there for all of them. He learned to bathe her without making her embarrassed, learned to change her diapers when needed, learned that sometimes she needed silence and other times she needed conversation. Learned that caring for someone wasn't about being perfect, it was about being present. The company adjusted. Richard promoted William to majority partner, giving him more decision-making power. He hired new managers to take on roles that were once only his. And he discovered the world didn't end because he wasn't controlling every detail. In fact, he found he had more time. Time to have lunch with Emily. Time to talk with Dorothy about her life, about her grandchildren he had never asked about before. Time for himself, to read, think, just be. One afternoon, Michael came to visit him. The two sat in the garden of the house, drinking coffee. You know, when you started missing meetings, I thought you were making a mistake, Michael said. But now, seeing you like this, I think it was the best decision you ever made. Why? Because you seem human, Michael laughed. Years ago, you were a machine. Efficient, successful, but a machine. And machines don't have a life, they just function. And now? Now you're living. Michael took a sip of coffee. And honestly, I prefer doing business with someone who's alive. Richard smiled. It was funny how things changed. He was sure that taking care of his mother would destroy his career, would make people lose respect for him. But the opposite had happened. People respected him more. Daniel had commented how he admired Richard's dedication to his family. William had said he was an example, And even competitors, people who used to see him as a money-making machine, now treated him with more warmth, more humanity. One day, Emily came home with a proposal. "Remember that project I had before we got married?" she asked. Richard vaguely remembered. Emily had worked at an NGO that helped families care for the elderly at home. She had left the job when they got married because he had said she didn't need to work. "I remember. A friend of mine, Sarah Johnson, called me. She's setting up a new program and wants my help." Emily was excited in a way Richard hadn't seen in years. It would be 3 times a week, a few hours a day. And I could bring Mrs. Margaret whenever I wanted. In fact, she would be perfect for the program. What is the program? A space where families caring for elderly people with dementia can meet, exchange experiences, learn techniques, get support. Emily smiled. And the elderly stay together, do activities suitable for them. It's therapeutic for everyone. You want to go back to work? I do. She didn't hesitate. I love taking care of your mother, Richard, but I also need something of my own, something that makes me feel useful beyond these walls. Richard noticed something. For years he had seen Emily as an extension of the house, beautiful, present, perfect, but never as a person with her own dreams, with her own needs. "Do it," he said. "And if you need help with my mother on the days you're away, I'm here." "Really?" Emily seemed surprised. "Really?" Richard took her hand. "You've taken care of me, my mother, this house. Let me give back a little." 2 weeks later, Emily started the program. And she was right about Mrs. Margaret. The elderly woman loved it. She stayed with other elderly people. They did crafts together, sang old songs, told stories. And on the days she was more confused, there were trained people there to help. Richard used those hours to work, but also to do other things. He went to the doctor for the first time in years. He started therapy, something he had never considered before. And slowly, very slowly, he began to understand himself better. The therapist, Dr. Jonathan Brown, was a calm man who asked questions that made Richard think. "Why do you think you chose to work so much?" Dr. Jonathan asked in one session. "To provide comfort, to not go through hardships." "But you were already comfortable 20 years ago. You were no longer going through hardships." Dr. Jonathan leaned in. "So, why continue?" Richard didn't have a ready answer. He thought about it for days. And then he realized it wasn't about the money, it never had been. It was about proving that he was worth something, proving that he wasn't like his father, proving that he was important. "But you were already important," Dr. Jonathan said when Richard shared this revelation. "To your mother, to your wife, to the people around you. You just weren't paying attention." He was right. Richard had been so focused on proving his worth to the world that he had forgotten to see the value he already had to the people who mattered. 6 months after Mrs. Margaret had returned home, Richard decided to do something special. It was her birthday. 72 years. He wanted to celebrate in a way that meant something. Emily helped organize. They invited people from the caregiver program. They invited Dorothy and her family. They invited the partners and their wives. And Richard made sure to cook himself. It was a simple recipe. Cornmeal cake, the same cake that Mrs. Margaret used to make when he was a child. He burned the first attempt. The second one was too dry. But on the third, with help from Emily and Dorothy, he succeeded. On the birthday, the house was full. Laughter, conversations, music. Mrs. Margaret was at the center of everything, smiling. She didn't recognize everyone there, but she was happy. Happy to be surrounded by people, by warmth, by life. When it was time for the cake, Richard brought it personally. The candles were lit, and everyone started singing Happy Birthday. Mrs. Margaret clapped excitedly, and when they finished singing, she closed her eyes to make a wish. "What did you wish for, Mother?" Richard asked afterward. Mrs. Margaret looked at him, and her eyes were clear. "I wished that my son would continue to be happy, that he would continue to be this good man he has become." She touched his face. "I wished that he wouldn't get lost again." Richard felt the tears coming. He didn't try to hide them, just let them fall, and hugged his mother. Around them, people kept talking, laughing, living. And in that moment, Richard realized that was success. Not the million-dollar contracts, not the headlines in the papers. That, love, family, presence. Later, when the guests had left and the house was quiet, Richard and Emily put Mrs. Margaret to sleep. The elderly woman was tired but happy. "Thank you," she said, already half asleep. "Thank you for bringing me back home." "Always, Mom," Richard said. "Always." When they left the room, Emily held Richard's hand. "I'm proud of you," she said. "Why?" "For finding your way back," she smiled. "It's not easy to change. It's not easy to admit you were wrong, but you did it." Richard pulled his wife closer. "I didn't do it alone. You showed me the way. You and my mother." "We just opened the door," Emily corrected. "You were the one who decided to walk through it." That night, for the first time in months, Richard slept without anxiety, without worries. He slept knowing he had done the right thing, that he was where he was supposed to be. But life, as always, had more lessons to teach. 2 weeks after the birthday, Mrs. Margaret had an episode. It was in the middle of the night. Richard and Emily woke up to screams coming from downstairs. When they reached her room, they found the elderly woman on the floor, trembling, her eyes wide with fear. "Mom!" Richard rushed to help her up, but she flinched at his touch. "Don't hurt me, don't hurt me," she screamed, not recognizing her son. Emily called Dr. Robert, who arrived in 20 minutes. He examined Mrs. Margaret, who was still agitated but less frightened now. "It's a severe anxiety attack," the doctor explained afterward. "It can happen with dementia patients. Her brain doesn't process the environment correctly, and she gets scared." "Is there anything we can do?" Richard asked, and there was desperation in his voice. "Presence, calm, routine," Dr. Robert was direct. "Doctor, I see, and sometimes anxiety medication, but the key is making her feel safe." Richard spent the rest of the night sitting by his mother's bedside. She had fallen back asleep, but he couldn't. He kept looking at her, seeing how fragile she seemed, how her breathing was uneven. "You should rest," Emily said, entering the room with 2 cups of tea. "I can't." Richard accepted the tea but didn't drink it. "I keep thinking, what if she has another episode? What if I'm not here?" "You can't control everything, Richard." Emily sat beside him. "Even if you're here, she might have episodes. It's part of the illness." "I know, but it's so hard." He finally looked at his wife. "Seeing her like this, scared, confused, treating me like a stranger, it's like I'm losing her bit by bit." "You are," Emily was honest, "and it's painful." "But Richard, you're giving her something she didn't have at the care center: security, love, a home. And on the good days, in the moments when she recognizes you, that's worth everything." Richard knew she was right, but it didn't make the pain any less. The nighttime episodes became more frequent. Some weeks she had 2 or 3. Dr. Robert adjusted the medication and that helped a bit, but the dementia was progressing. Richard could see it clearly now. Mrs. Margaret's moments of clarity became rarer. Whole days went by without her recognizing anyone. She called Richard by different names. Frank sometimes, other times Richie, but the 5-year-old Richie, not the 47-year-old man in front of her. One afternoon, Richard was sitting with her in the garden. Mrs. Margaret was quiet, looking at the flowers. "Pretty," she said, pointing to the red roses. "They are," Richard agreed. "You planted these roses about 15 years ago, remember?" She looked at him, confused. "I planted them." Richard smiled, even though it hurt. He said he wanted red flowers because they were Jennifer's favorites. Upon hearing her daughter's name, something shifted in Mrs. Margaret's face. Her eyes filled with tears. "Jennifer," she whispered. "My girl." "Yes, Mom, your girl." "She's gone." Mrs. Margaret began to cry. "My girl is gone and I couldn't save her." Richard took his mother's hand, feeling his own throat tighten. "It wasn't your fault. You did everything you could. It wasn't enough." She sobbed. "It's never enough. You care, you love, but you can't protect them from everything. And when they leave..." A piece of you goes with them. Richard realized she wasn't just talking about Jennifer. She was talking about loss in general, about what it means to love someone knowing that one day you might lose them. And he understood the pain his mother carried, the pain he had been avoiding feeling for so long. "I'm sorry, Mum," he said, and he didn't exactly know why he was apologizing. For Jennifer's death, for the distance he had put between them, for not being there, for everything. Mrs. Margaret looked at him, and for a brief moment, she truly saw him, saw the grown son, the man he had become. "You're here now," she said. "And that's what matters. Not yesterday, not tomorrow, but the now." And then the fog returned, and she was lost again. But the words stayed with Richard. Present. It was all he could control. Not the past with its regrets, not the future with its fears, just the present, that moment there with her. 9 months after Mrs. Margaret had come home, something changed in Emily. Richard noticed she was quieter, more distant, not in a bad way, but as if she was holding something back. "Is everything okay?" he asked one night. Emily was sitting on the bed, looking out the window. "I'm thinking about something," she finally said. "About what?" She turned to look at him. "About what comes after." Richard didn't understand immediately. "After what?" "After Mrs. Margaret." Emily paused, searching for the right words. "Her dementia is getting worse, we both know that. And there will come a day when she's no longer here. And I keep thinking, what happens to us after?" The question took Richard by surprise. He hadn't thought about it, or maybe he didn't want to. "What do you mean?" "Richard, we were on the path to divorce. You know that." Emily spoke carefully. "And the only reason we're still together is because I decided to bring your mother home. That gave us a common purpose, something to work on together. But when she's no longer here," her voice broke, "will we still have anything?" Richard felt the ground disappear under his feet. He hadn't thought about it, didn't want to think about it, but now that Emily had put it into words, he couldn't ignore it. "Do you still want a divorce?" "I don't know." She was honest. "I see you trying. I see you trying to be better, and part of me is proud of that, moved by that. But another part," she wiped away a tear, "another part still remembers 5 years of feeling invisible, of eating alone, sleeping alone, living alone, even though I was married." "I've changed," Richard said, and there was desperation in his voice. "I know you've changed, but you changed because you were forced to, because the situation demanded it." Emily looked at him. "And I keep thinking, if your mother weren't here, would you still have changed? Or would you go back to being the man who lives locked in his office, traveling 300 days a year?" Richard wanted to say no, that he would have changed anyway. But the truth was, he didn't know. He wasn't sure. "I don't want to lose you," he admitted. "Not after finally understanding how much you matter." "And I don't want to lose you either." Emily took his hand. "But I don't want to stay out of obligation, or for convenience. I want to stay because we chose each other, every single day. Not because your mother keeps us together, but because we genuinely want to be together." "How do we do that?" Richard asked. "We figure it out." Emily gave a small smile. "Together, slowly, without pressure." It was strange in a way. They had been married for 5 years, but it felt like they were starting from scratch, learning each other again, or maybe for the first time. Richard started doing small things. He left notes for Emily around the house. He asked about her work, genuinely interested in the answers. He planned little moments together, even if it was just 30 minutes having coffee after Mrs. Margaret went to sleep. And Emily did the same. She told him about her days, shared her worries, let Richard into parts of her life he had never seen before. "I lost my mother 10 years ago," she told him one night. "Cancer. It was quick, 3 months from diagnosis until—" She didn't finish the sentence. "And I was there every day. I saw her wasting away, losing her hair, her strength, and in the end she was so different from the woman I knew." Richard listened in silence. When she finally left, I felt relief, and then I hated myself for feeling relief. Emily wiped away tears. How could I feel relieved about my own mother leaving? Because you were watching her suffer, Richard said softly. And relief isn't a lack of love. It's just the end of suffering. That's what everyone said. But I didn't believe it. Emily looked at him. Until I met Mrs. Margaret. Until I saw another person going through something similar and saw that caring isn't about preventing the leaving. It's about making the time that still exists meaningful. And that's why you insisted on bringing my mother home. Richard understood. It wasn't just about her. It was about you, too. About doing it differently. It was, Emily confessed. Selfish, maybe. But it was my chance to do it right, to have no regrets. Richard pulled his wife closer, and for the first time in a long time he truly saw her. Not the beautiful woman who decorated his home, not the perfect wife who impressed his partners, but Emily, a woman with her own pains, her own history, her own needs. Thank you, he said, for being strong when I was weak. We were both strong at different times, she corrected. That's how it works. When one falls, the other holds them up. The months kept passing. The company was doing well, surprisingly. William had proven to be an excellent leader, and Richard discovered he could trust his partners more than he thought. He still worked, still had important meetings, but had found a balance. Mrs. Margaret was declining slowly but steadily. Now she rarely had fully lucid days. Most of the time she was in a state of mild confusion, present but not fully connected to reality. But there were moments, small flashes, like when she heard an old song and started singing along, remembering every word perfectly, or when Richard entered the room wearing a blue shirt and she said, "Blue was always your favorite color," showing that something was still there, some memory still alive. Richard learned to value these moments. He no longer expected her to be the mother from before. He accepted her as she was now, and found beauty in that too. One afternoon, they were in the garden. Mrs. Margaret was in a wheelchair now, her mobility having decreased significantly, but she liked being outside, feeling the sun, hearing the birds. "Richie," she called suddenly, and her voice was clearer than it had been in weeks. "Yes, Mother." "Are you happy?" The question was simple but profound. "I am," Richard answered, and realized it was true. "Happier than I've been in a long time." "Good." She smiled. That's all a mother wants, to see her son happy. "Are you happy too, Mother?" Mrs. Margaret thought for a moment. "I am at peace," she finally said. "There are days when I don't know where I am, who the people are. But there's one thing I always know." "What is it?" "That I'm safe. That I'm loved." She looked at him. "And that, my son, is all that matters in the end." Richard held his mother's hand, feeling its fragility. The bones so delicate now, the skin so thin. But she was still his mother, still the woman who had raised him, who had sacrificed so much for him. "Thank you," he said, "for everything, for every sacrifice, every sleepless night, every meal skipped so I could eat, for loving me even when I didn't deserve it." Mrs. Margaret looked at him with those blue eyes that were beginning to grow cloudy with age. "You always deserved it, Richie," she said. "From the first moment I held you, you always deserved all the love in the world." It was one of those moments Richard knew he would keep forever. One of the final moments of true clarity his mother would have, and he was grateful to be present for it. 2 years after Mrs. Margaret had returned home, something happened. Richard was at the office when he got a call from Emily. It was late at night. "Richard, you need to come." Her voice sounded strange. "What happened?" "It's Mrs. Margaret. She fell. I can't wake her up. The ambulance is on its way." Richard ran. He threw papers in the air, knocked over the chair, but didn't care. He raced down the stairs in seconds and reached his mother's room just as the paramedics arrived. Mrs. Margaret was on the floor, unconscious. Emily was beside her, holding her hand, her face wet with tears. "Mother," Richard knelt beside her. "Mother, can you hear me?" The paramedics moved him aside, starting to check her vital signs. Richard stood there, helpless, watching as they put his mother on a stretcher, as they carried her to the ambulance. He and Emily followed in the car, driving silently through the New York night. At the hospital, hours passed like an eternity. Richard paced back and forth in the hallway, unable to stand still. Emily sat in one of the uncomfortable chairs, her hands over her face. Finally, Dr. Robert appeared. He had an expression Richard couldn't read. "She's had a stroke," the doctor went straight to the point. It wasn't massive, but in someone her age, with the condition she already had. "Will she be okay?" Richard interrupted. Dr. Robert sighed. "Richard, we need to talk about options." Those words, those terrible words that meant things weren't okay, that difficult decisions would have to be made. They sat in a small room and Dr. Robert explained. The stroke had further affected Mrs. Margaret's already compromised brain. She was stable, but now almost completely unresponsive. She could breathe on her own, but didn't interact with her surroundings. "Could she get better?" Emily asked. "Unlikely." Dr. Robert was honest. "It's most probable she'll remain in this state. She could live like this for weeks, maybe months, but she won't wake up, won't speak. She'll be there, but she won't be present." "What do we do?" Richard asked, and his voice sounded distant to his own ears. "That's up to you." Dr. Robert put a hand on Richard's shoulder. "She can stay here at the hospital, where she'll be constantly monitored. Or you can take her home, keep her comfortable there." "I want to take her home," Richard said immediately. "Are you sure? You'll need constant care." "I'm sure." Richard looked at Emily, who nodded in agreement. If these are her final days, I want it to be at home, not here, not in a cold hospital." Dr. Robert agreed, and 2 days later, Mrs. Margaret was brought back home. They turned her room into a mini-hospital. Monitoring equipment, medications, everything she needed. And they hired a nurse to help, but Richard made sure to be there as much as possible. He would sit by her bedside for hours. He talked to her, even though he knew she probably couldn't hear. He told her about his day, about the company, about old memories. Sometimes he played music, those old songs she used to sing. Emily was always there too. She held Mrs. Margaret's hand, brushed her hair, kept her clean and comfortable. And every now and then, when she thought no one was looking, she cried. 1 week passed. Then 2. Mrs. Margaret remained there, breathing, existing, but not really present. It was as if the person she was had already left, but her body hadn't realized it yet. One night, Richard was alone with her. Emily had gone to rest, the nurse had gone to dinner. He held his mother's hand and finally let the tears fall. "I miss you so much, Mom," he said. "I know you're still here, but you've already gone, haven't you? You're already somewhere better." Her breathing remained steady, unchanged. "I wish I had been a better son. I wish I had realized sooner what really matters." The words came out between sobs. "But you taught me. Even now, even like this, you're teaching me. About love, about sacrifice, about being present." He laid his head on his mother's hands and cried. He cried for the lost years, for the distance he had put between them, for all the wrong choices he had made. But he also cried for the good memories for the last 2 years, for having had the chance in the end to do the right thing. When Emily returned and found Richard like that, she said nothing. She just sat beside him, put her hand on his back, and stayed there, present, because that's what you did. That's what love meant. 3 weeks after Mrs. Margaret had the stroke, Richard woke up in the middle of the night. He didn't know why. He just woke up with a strange feeling in his chest. He went downstairs to his mother's room. The nurse was there, but she was asleep in the chair. Richard approached the bed, and something was different. It took him a moment to realize what. Mrs. Margaret's breathing was weaker, slower. Each breath seemed to take a huge effort. "Mum," he took her hand. "Mum, I'm here." Her eyes opened, not fully but a little, and for a second, a brief and perfect second, she looked at him. Really looked. And there was recognition there. "Richie." The word was so quiet he almost didn't hear it. "My boy." "I'm here, Mum. I'll always be here." Tears streamed down Richard's face. You are a good son. Each word was a struggle. A good man. Only because you taught me to be. He held her hand tighter. Everything good I am, I learned from you. She smiled. It was small, weak, but it was a smile. Take care of Emily, Mrs. Margaret continued. She loves you. I will, I promise. And allow yourself to be happy. Her eyes began to close. Life is too short not to be happy. Mom, don't go. Richard knew he was being selfish, but he couldn't help it. Please, not yet. But her eyes closed. Her breathing grew even weaker, and then stopped. Richard stood still for a moment, unable to process it, and then reality hit him like a wave. She was gone. His mother, the woman who had raised him, who had sacrificed everything for him, was gone. He laid his head on her chest and screamed, a primal scream full of pain and loss. The nurse woke up. Emily came running, but Richard couldn't stop. The pain was too great, too intense. Emily held her husband, letting him cry in her arms. And she cried too, for the woman who had become like a mother to her, for the loss they now shared. The following days were a blur. Arrangements for the burial, people coming to offer condolences, flowers, so many flowers. Dorothy cried as if she had lost a sister. The partners came, respectful and quiet. The people from the caregiver program, many of whom had known Mrs. Margaret, shared stories and memories. The burial was simple. Mrs. Margaret would have wanted it that way. No ostentation, no show. Just people who truly cared, saying a real goodbye. When they lowered the casket, Richard placed a red rose on top. The same rose she had planted in the garden, and whispered, "See you later, Mom, and thank you for everything." In the weeks that followed, the house felt empty. Even with Emily there, even with Dorothy working, there was a silence that hadn't been there before. Mrs. Margaret's absence was palpable, a hole that couldn't be filled. Richard buried himself in work for a few days. Old habits are hard to break. But then, one afternoon, Emily found him in the office, surrounded by papers. "You don't have to do this," and she said. "Do what?" "Hide in your work." She approached. "It's okay to feel pain. It's okay to cry." "I already cried." Richard didn't look at her. "Not enough." Emily turned his chair, making him face her. "Richard, your mother is gone. It hurts a lot. And you won't get over it by staying busy. You'll get over it by feeling, processing, allowing yourself to grieve." "If I stop, if I really feel all of this—" His voice broke. "I don't know if I can handle it." "You can." She held his face. "Because you're stronger than you think, and because I'm here. We'll get through this together." And they did. Day after day, Richard allowed himself to feel the loss, allowed himself to remember, allowed himself to cry. And Emily was there, always, on the good days and the bad days, as she had promised she would be. 1 month after the burial, Richard was in the garden, looking at the red roses his mother had planted. They were blooming, vibrant, and full of life. She loved these flowers. Emily joined him. "I know." Richard touched one of the petals gently. "Are you thinking we should sell the house? Start over somewhere else?" "Sell?" Emily seemed surprised. "Why?" "Because this house is full of memories of her, and I thought it would be painful for you to stay here." "It is painful," Emily admitted. "But it's a good pain. The kind of pain that comes from having loved someone deeply. And I don't want to run from it. I want to honor those memories by staying here, taking care of the place she loved." Richard looked at his wife, seeing her in a new light. She was strong in a way he had never been. Strong not by avoiding pain, but by facing it head-on. "I love you." The words came out without warning, but they were true. Emily looked at him, surprised. "Richard, I know it took me a while to realize it. I know I wasted years. But I love you, Emily. Not out of obligation, not for convenience, but because you showed me what really matters. Because you're the most amazing person I've ever met." He took her hands. And if you still want the divorce, I'll understand. But before you decide, you needed to know you are loved. Deeply and truly loved. Tears streamed down Emily's face. I don't want a divorce, she said. I never did, not really. I just wanted to be seen. To be heard. To be important. You are. Richard pulled her closer. You are the most important person in my life, and I'll spend the rest of my days proving that to you. They kissed there, among the red roses, under the afternoon sun, and it was a beginning. Not perfect, not without challenges, but it was real. It was honest. It was love. 6 months passed. Life went on, as it always does. Richard found a new balance between work and home. He spent more time with Emily, discovering new things about her every day. He helped her expand the caregiver program, using some of the company's resources to fund it. It was a way to honor his mother's memory, helping other families who were going through the same thing. One afternoon, Richard was organizing the room that had been his mother's. It was time not to forget, but to move forward. He found forgotten things, old photos, letters, little treasures she had kept over the years. And at the bottom of a drawer, he found an envelope with his name on it. The handwriting was his mother's, but shaky. She must have written this in the early stages of dementia, when she could still write. With trembling hands, Richard opened the envelope and read, My dear Richie, if you're reading this, it means I can no longer write, or perhaps I'm no longer even here. And that's okay, life is a cycle and we all eventually reach the end. I want you to know that I never regretted anything. Every sacrifice, every difficulty was worth it, because in the end I managed to give you something I never had as a child. The chance to be someone, to build something, to have a better life. I don't want you to carry guilt for anything. Not for the distance you put between us, not for the choices you made. You were trying to survive, trying to prove your worth, and you succeeded. You built an empire, became a respected man. I'm proud of you, but my greatest wish, my only true wish, is that you find happiness. Not the kind of happiness that comes from money or success, but the kind that comes from connection, from love, from being truly present with the people you love. Take care of Emily, she is special. I saw in her eyes the same kind of strength I had to have when I raised you alone. She loves you more than you realize. Don't lose her. And my son, when I'm no longer here, don't waste time with regrets. Live, love, be happy, because life is too short and too precious to be anything but true. Always yours, Mother. Richard read the letter 3 times, then 3 more. And each time tears fell, but now they were different tears, not just of sadness, but of gratitude. Gratitude for having had this woman as his mother. Gratitude for the last 2 years. Gratitude for the chance to have made peace before it was too late. He folded the letter carefully and put it back in the envelope. He would keep it forever. A reminder, not just of who she was, but of who he wanted to be. Did you find something? Emily appeared at the door. Richard showed her the letter, and she read it in silence. When she finished, her eyes were also wet. She was wise, Emily said, handing back the letter. She was, Richard agreed, and she was right about you. You are special. We are both special, Emily corrected. Together we are special. Richard looked around the room, walls that had seen so much, joy, pain, care, love, and he realized he was ready to transform that space into something new, something that honored the past, but also looked to the future. I was thinking, he said, how about we turn this room into an office for you? For the caregiver program. You could work from home, still be close. Emily looked surprised. You would do that? I would, Richard smiled. My mother would love knowing that this space is being used to help others, to make a difference. Then let's do it, Emily hugged her husband. Together. A year later, life had found a new rhythm. The room had been transformed into a cozy office, where Emily coordinated the program that now served over 100 families. Richard had become an active advocate for the cause, using his position to raise awareness about the challenges of caring for elderly people with dementia. The company remained prosperous, but now with Richard in a more balanced position. He had learned to delegate, to trust, not to feel he had to control everything alone. And most importantly, he and Emily had found each other again, not as they were before, but as something new, something stronger, something built not on convenience or appearances, but on mutual respect, understanding, and genuine love. One Saturday morning, they were in the garden planting new roses, red ones like the ones Mrs. Margaret had loved. Dorothy brought them coffee, and the three of them stood there talking, laughing, sharing stories. "Mrs. Margaret would be happy to see this," Dorothy said, looking at the flowers. "The two of you together tending her garden." "I think so," Richard agreed. "I think she would be happy knowing we finally understood what she was trying to teach us all along." "What's that?" Emily asked, even though she already knew the answer. "That in the end, all that matters is love." Richard looked at his wife. Love and being present, truly present, not just physically, but emotionally, completely. They finished planting the roses, and Richard stood for a moment looking at them. Small now, but they would grow. They would bloom. They would live for years, a constant reminder of the woman who had changed his life, not just by giving birth to him, by raising him, but also in the last years of her life, by teaching him the most important lessons of all. That evening, Richard and Emily were on the porch watching the sunset. It was one of their new routines, pausing at the end of the day to just be together, without distractions, without hurry. "Do you still think about her?" Emily asked. "Every day," Richard admitted. "But it doesn't hurt as much as it used to. Now it's more longing. But a good kind of longing, you know. The kind that comes from having had something precious, even if for a short time." 2 years, Emily recalled. "It was only 2 years she was here with us." "But what 2 years?" Richard smiled. "I learned more about myself, about what matters, about how to live, in those 2 years than in my entire life before." "She knew she didn't have much time," Emily said thoughtfully. "I think that's why every moment seemed so intense. She was teaching us everything she could, as fast as she could. And she succeeded." Richard took his wife's hand. "She taught us about patience, about compassion, about being present, about how to care for someone not out of obligation, but out of love, and about how to let ourselves be cared for." They fell silent, just watching the colors change in the sky, red, orange, purple, a natural painting that happened every day, but that few stopped to really see. "Do you think we'll have children someday?" Emily asked suddenly. The question surprised Richard. They had never seriously talked about it before. "Do you want to?" "I don't know," she was honest. "I'm 34. Time is passing. And I keep thinking, after everything we've been through, after seeing how caring for someone can transform a person, I think I'd like to pass that on." "You would be an amazing mother," Richard said with conviction. "We would be amazing parents," Emily corrected. "Together." Richard thought about it. The idea of having a child, of raising a life, of passing on the lessons he had learned. It was frightening and exciting at the same time. "Let's try," he decided. "Not now, not yet, but soon, when we're ready." "When we're ready," Emily agreed. "And we'll raise that child knowing the story of their grandmother, about the strong woman she was, about the sacrifices she made, about the love she gave. And about how she saved us," Richard added, "because that's what she did. Saved us from ourselves." The sun finished setting, and the stars began to appear. Richard and Emily went into the house, hand in hand. And if he looked back to that day 2 years ago, when he had come home furious to see his mother in the kitchen, he could hardly recognize the man he was. That man was so lost, so focused on the wrong things, so convinced he knew what was important. But he was wrong, deeply wrong. And it took a brave woman and a sick mother to show him the way back. Back home, back to himself, back to what really mattered. As they prepared for bed, Richard stopped in front of the mirror. He looked at his reflection. He was 49 now, a few grey hairs starting to show, wrinkles around the eyes, marks of a life lived. But the man looking back was different. He wasn't perfect. He still made mistakes. He still had bad days. But he was real. He was true. And he was trying. Every day he was trying to be better. "Thank you, Mum," he whispered to the reflection, somehow knowing she could hear wherever she was, "for not giving up on me, for giving me one last chance to do the right thing." And that night, for the first time since she had gone away, Richard slept without sadness in his heart. He slept with gratitude, with love, with peace, because in the end she was right. Life was too short and too precious to be anything but true. End of story. And you, dear listener, what did you think of this journey? Have you ever gone through something similar, having to care for someone you loved? Or maybe you know someone who is in that situation now. Share your experiences and thoughts in the comments. Do you think Richard made the right choices in the end? We would love to read your honest opinion. Thank you so much for joining us this far. Don't forget to leave your like and, more importantly, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss other stories that touch the heart. See you next time.